Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. Today, I am very excited to talk about this topic of EB5 investments and the EB5 program, because we have some exciting new news to share with you regarding a program that really has, for the most part, been non-existent for the last 9 months. So a few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm, but we do focus primarily on investor-based visas, so EB5 visas, E2 visas, and a few other visas that we're going to talk about briefly during the presentation. This webinar series is one that is ongoing, so we regularly have webinars, at least 2 per month, but in many months like this month, we will have 4. We'll have at least one a week, and in some cases more than one a week. So definitely in terms of, one of the things you're going to be getting at the end of this presentation is a link to some of our upcoming webinars. For example, we have an E2 visa webinar that's occurring next week, so you can see a full list of the webinars that are coming up. In terms of some other things that you're going to receive after the presentation is done, you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. So the presentation that I go through, as well, this event is being recorded, so we convert it to a YouTube video, and we will send you the recording of the event so that you have that as a reference. And then we'll also send you an EB5 guide. So this is a comprehensive guide that we pulled together that goes through some of the things that we talked about, but in a nice, concise format, and a document that you can have as a reference tool going forward. In terms of questions and questions, you can add questions to either the chat box or the Q&A box. We will get to all questions. There's plenty of time, and we may not answer the question exactly when you list the question. However, we will get to questions, and there's time at the end of the presentation to go through questions. So without further ado, let us jump into the presentation. Okay, so before I jump into the EB5 part of the presentation, I want to just briefly describe some of the different types of investor visas and maybe compare and contrast them a little bit. So we have the E2 visa. One of the big problems with the E2 visa is that the E2 visa is only available for individuals from certain countries. The other thing with the E2 visa is, unlike the EB5 investor visa, this particular visa is a temporary visa. The EB5 visa is a green card, so a more permanent visa. The other thing with E2 visas is the investment amount is very subjective. It depends really on the type of business that you are starting, whereas you'll see when we come to the EB5 that it is a very, very specific and objective investment amount that's required. And similarly with EB5, it's a very specific number of employees that are required, but when you're looking at an E2 visa, there is no set number. The next type of investor visa that we do a number of is national interest waiver. This is a green card, just like the EB5. This falls under the EB2 green card category. So this is a green card. And really, at the end of the day, this particular green card is looking at whether or not the particular endeavor that you are engaging in or plan to engage in is of national interest and importance to the United States. We run separate, on all of these topics that I'm going through right now, we have separate webinars that usually exceed an hour on each of these topics. So national interest waiver, for example, I know that there is one scheduled for this month. And as I mentioned earlier, that for E2 visas, we have one scheduled for next week. The third investor visa is the International Entrepreneur Rule. This is a relatively newcomer. It's something that was established a while ago during the Obama administration, but right at the end of the Obama administration, and the next administration paused this program, so there weren't really any applications filed. And now with the Biden administration in power, they have revived this program, but it is relatively new. And the one benefit of this program is it is not country specific, so people who maybe aren't eligible for an E2 visa can consider this particular program. But again, there's a separate webinar on International Entrepreneur Rule that you can sign up for to get the details. And then finally, we come to EB5, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time going through today. So the first thing I want to kind of go through is the program overview and the history, because there really has been a lot going on with this program over the last year. So I just want to put some of the things that we're going to talk about in context. So what had happened with this program is that during the last administration, they made a number of changes to the program. For example, they increased the investment amount, the minimum investment amount to $900,000. They made it more difficult to qualify for the lower investment amount. So it was either $900,000 or $1.8 million, and they made it more difficult to qualify for the lower investment amount, and made some other changes to the program as well. So what happened then is someone or a group of people sued the US government and said that the person that was in power at the time didn't have the ability or power to make those changes. So that happened before June 30th of 2021. And the district court said that they agreed with the plaintiff, the people who brought the lawsuit, and said that the acting head of USCIS didn't have the power to do that. And so they said that all of those rules were scrapped. And then what that meant in effect was that the rules went back to the old rules of the $500,000 for a minimum investment and $100,000, $1 million rather, for the maximum investment. So the government initially appealed that. The current administration appealed it initially, but then they dropped the appeal. So then when they dropped the appeal, we knew that the investment amount is set at $500,000. So it's for the minimum, and there's not going to be a problem with that. So then the other thing that happened last year was that the regional center program, we're going to talk about the difference between the regional center and the direct investment program, but the regional center program there are two types of EB5s. One is regional center, one is direct. The regional center program, the law there's a requirement that that particular program is renewed periodically. So it doesn't just, it's not just automatically entrenched in law, that Congress has to actually reauthorize that program on a regular basis. So those authorizations in the past occurred without any problem at all. But then we came to June 30th. So we had a few things going on, right? We had the lawsuit that said the new investment amount is $500,000. But then also the program was supposed to be reauthorized June 30th of 2021. But in an unprecedented event, it wasn't authorized. It did happen once before, but it was a very different circumstance and for a very short period of time. And we all thought, okay, well, maybe it's just a very short temporary lapse. Maybe it'll be reauthorized again in September, but it wasn't reauthorized again until March 11th of this year. And this created a number of problems because even individuals who had applied for an EB5 and had received an approval of their I829 petition, so the merits, they were qualified. We had one client who went to their interview in London for the green card, and their interview was scheduled for July, and so they were in London, but the interview ended up being canceled because the program didn't in effect get reauthorized at the end of June, and there was no basis for the consulate to approve the green card without the program being reauthorized. But so now what we have is the program on March 11th, the program was reauthorized. However, and this time there's no doubt that the person who is in charge has authority to make these changes. However, the program was reauthorized with a number of changes, and we're going to talk through all of those changes during this presentation. But now where we're at, it's March 17th, 2022. Today, the day that this webinar is being done. The program was reauthorized on March 11th, 2022, and there were a number of changes that were made. And part of this presentation, we're going to go through some of those changes. Now, before we touch on the changes, I do want to spend a bit of time talking about the difference between a regional center and direct investment. So, if I talk about regional center, let me just use an example. So we have some clients who invested in a regional center project where they were building a shipping yard. They, being a big company, was building a shipping yard and for ships to come and dock. And so it was a multi-million-dollar project. Like, I can't recall exactly how much it was, but maybe a $300 or $400 million project, or maybe even more. And the project qualified for EB5 funding. So they submitted an application to the government to say, can we attract EB5 investors so that they can get their green card and we can get funding? So win-win situation. So that, then what would happen is the EB5 investor would give that company, at that time it was $500,000, and then the EB5 investor would sit back and do nothing, right? The company would be responsible for building the shipyard, hiring the employees, doing everything, and then years down the road, the individual would get their green card. So it was a very, very passive form of investment. For someone who just wanted the green card and was fine with a passive form of investment. But this was an investment and a security. So it did have risks. So there are, a number of examples of regional centers where people have given the regional center their money and have not gotten the green card and not gotten their money back. The regional center either was subject to fraud or closed down or whatever. They couldn't build what they thought they were going to build, et cetera. And all of those things, just like any other investment, if you put your money in the stock market or any other investment, your investment is subject to risk, and it's risk really that you have very little control over because someone else is driving, running the show. Now, the other big thing with regional centers and something that made them attractive is that one of the requirements that for EB5 that we're going to go through is that the project has to create 10 full-time jobs. So for each investment, the project has to create 10 full-time jobs. Now, for regional centers, you can include indirect jobs. And what that means is that you can get an economist to say that, okay, well, the shipyard's going to be built. And now that the shipyard's going to be built, and there are going to be, hundreds of people that are working in the shipyard. However, we can also get an economist to say that because this shipyard maybe is a gentrification to the area, it's going to actually have a knock-on effect and have, maybe there's going to be a laundromat that opens, a supermarket that opens, all of these other things that are going to create jobs, and those are considered indirect jobs. They're people that don't necessarily work for the shipyard, but jobs that are created as a result of the shipyard being built. And that sometimes, that's a big help because the biggest thing with EB5 is creating the jobs. And for regional centers, you can include indirect jobs, but for direct investments that we're going to talk about, they can only be direct jobs. Now, a direct investment, this would be an individual that, let's say that someone, comes to the US and they say that I want to start a hotel, right? And they start a hotel, not buy a hotel, start a hotel. So they buy the land and they start building the hotel themselves. Let's say it's a smaller hotel. And, they're interested in, control over the process. They're interested in hiring who they want, control over their own funds. That's their profile. They have potential for higher returns. It's their business, right? So there's no kind of restriction. When you look at regional centers, you cannot have a guaranteed return. And often the return is low or negative. So, and that's one thing I forgot to mention with regional centers is that usually the regional centers have an administrative fee of between $30,000 and $50,000, sometimes even more. The return, like, so you invest $500,000, and when you factor in the administrative fee, the return actually would be negative in most regional centers, right? So the return is often like 0.5% or maybe even lower these days because you can't even get that in banks these days. So you definitely direct investment, you have much more control over your investment. And but only direct jobs are accounted. So jobs that you will, that particular hotel in this example, that particular hotel will people that they will hire. And we're going to talk about the requirement for employment in more detail when we get to that slide. One interesting thing about direct investment, though, is that this program is not subject to reauthorization. So the whole time that the regional center program was in abeyance, the direct investment program was alive and well, and we had people investing $500,000 during the period up to March 11th and starting new ventures and applying for EB5 using direct investment. So there's no reauthorization that's required. And then the other thing with this particular category is that funds that you have already invested can be used. So in a situation like, for example, if someone has an E2 and they've already invested in the E2, some of the investment that they've already made in the E2 can be counted towards the EB5 investment, whereas if they're applying for a regional center, that wouldn't apply, right? The regional center is going to want the full, the full 500,000 or 800,000 in this case. So now let's look at the EB5 requirements. And these requirements apply to all EB5. So whether it's regional center or whether it's direct investment, the requirements, the fundamental or underlying requirements are the same. There's just some nuanced things, like, for example, what we talked about with direct versus indirect jobs. So the key requirement is that you invest a large amount of money, either 800,000 or just over $1 million in a new commercial enterprise. A new commercial enterprise isn't a new enterprise. I can't recall the exact date, but I think it's an enterprise that's formed after 1990 or something. But you can just check. You can email me and I can send you the detail on the exact date. But it's not a new enterprise. It can be one that's been around for a while. So the individual invests. So whether they're investing 800,000 in a regional center, or they're investing 800,000 to start their own, enterprise. They've invested the money, and then you would look to see, which investment can be included. For the actual investment itself, for example, you couldn't include money that you spent on legal fees, or, as I mentioned with the regional center, those administrative costs, even though they're excessive. It's not like you can invest 750,000 and then pay 50,000 in the administrative costs and then say that you've reached the 800,000. It would have to be 800,000, and then you'd be subject to pay the administrative fees and any legal fees that you're required to pay. The investment can be made over time. We have the EB5 Direct project where when I say over time, meaning that the investment should be made by the time you file the application. There are rare instances where that's not the case, but for the purposes of this discussion, investment should be made by the time you file the application. But you could have a situation where you made the investment over a multiple year period, and that's completely fine. It doesn't all have to be made at once. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind is, this is investment versus retained earnings. So let's say that you started a company a couple of years ago, and then the company made a few $1 million in those 2 years, and the $2 million were reinvested and spent on things. That's not investment. The investment is only, so retained earnings can't count. Investment is money that you independently have outside of the company that is invested in the company. In the example that I just gave with retained earnings, that could count if the individual were to pay the money to the company was to pay the money to the individual paid tax on that money, and then after the person paid tax on the money was reinvested back into the company, and you should have bank and audit trails to show all of that. It's not just that you said that you did it, that the money was actually transferred to different bank accounts, etc. The E2 and EB5, they have a number of differences. With this presentation, I'm not going to focus as much on them but I do want to just point out that we do have a very specific E2 to EB5 webinar that we regularly do, where we go through these descriptions of the differences in a lot more detail. Just one key difference is that for E2, for example, you can include legal fees and things, administrative fees in your investment amount, whereas EB5 you can't. The other kind of big thing is E2 is completely fine with purchasing a business. So if you just said, okay, I'm going to take $300,000 and I'm going to purchase a restaurant, that would be completely fine for E2, but it wouldn't be for EB5. EB5 requires that the investment is invested in the business and not money that actually is just paid to a seller. So in that example, what I was referring was that a seller was selling a restaurant for $300,000. The E2 person pays the seller $300,000 and then they take the restaurant. That situation won't work for EB5. In that situation, the restaurant could serve as an EB5 vehicle, but the individual would have to independently invest an additional $800,000 in the restaurant, and that $800,000 would have to be linked to the job creation. The other thing with EB5, and this is again regional centers and direct investment, is you have to prove that the money came from a legitimate source. And this analysis is nothing like E2. For anyone on the webinar that went through this analysis for E2, this is E2 times 1,000 in terms of the level and depth of documentation that's required for this particular requirement. So when you do a regional center application, often when you're applying at a regional center, there have been people in that regional center that have already been approved. So what USCIS, the only thing they're adjudicating at that point for a regional center is your source of funds, generally speaking, right? So definitely something to keep in mind. and some, something to look at. In terms of the investment, it has to be an equity investment. It can't be. So when you do a regional center, they usually give you these things called limited partnership units. But if you were investing in another business, it's equity that you would take back, not a loan. But it can be any percentage. It's unlike E2, which would require for an investor to own 50%. This can really be any percentage that can be invested without even 0.5%. So now here's the crux of the EB5 program, and it's the creation of jobs. And you are required to create 10 full-time jobs. So that's not 10 part-time jobs, it's 10 full-time jobs, and it's 10 full-time jobs for US citizens or green card holders. So, these jobs don't have to be created for some time. You have the I829 petition, that's going to take years to be approved, and then the jobs don't have to be created until a couple of years after that's approved. However, at the time of application, if it's a direct investment, you're going to submit a detailed business plan showing how you plan to hire the jobs. And if it's a regional center, the regional center is taking care of all of that, because they do have a business plan that's included in the filing. That's going to be submitted as well. But they're going to have the details showing how they plan to create the total number of jobs from the project, including the indirect jobs. They will have an economist report that's included in that as well. And then this really points back to the example that I went over with respect to purchasing a business. And the reason that doesn't qualify for EB5 is that the money doesn't go towards job creation. Instead, it goes to the seller. So, and if you do invest in a business, the money, so let's say you invested in a business, let's say you change the example slightly and you bought a restaurant, but the money went into the restaurant. That can count, right? But if the restaurant already had 4 employees, those 4 employees that were there before aren't going to count. Generally speaking, there's, again, exceptions to everything, right? But generally speaking, that's not going to count, because the employees were already there. So the money that you invested didn't have anything to do with bringing those employees in. So there is a link that's required, and then you just have to document the full-time positions, because it is it's for qualified workers, right? So that they're green card holders, that they're U.S. citizens, and that they're full-time. So all of that's important. In terms of the process for filing an EB5 petition, again, for regional centers and direct investment, it's the same. You file an I829 petition, and then if you're in the United States, you can file an I485 petition for an adjustment of status. And if you're not in the United States, you can file for consular processing. And if you're in the United States, you can file for consular processing as well. And when you're filing an application, if you're not sure that you're going to adjust status, and it's interesting, because the advice we used to give before March 11th was, in every single instance, you should check the box that you're doing consular processing. Now, probably almost one of the most significant changes in the legislation that doesn't seem to be getting a lot of press, but it is a significant change, is that you're permitted to file the I485 at the same time as you file the I829. So now you do have to go through a strategy discussion with respect to, is it better to file the I485 at the time of filing the I829? And that's something that you can speak to with your immigration lawyer. Then after you get your green card, then 2 years after having the green card, you submit an application, which is an I829 application. And that I829 application is an application that you submit to remove the condition. So basically to show that you have actually hired the 10 people, or the regional center will be showing that, whichever one you use. But that would be the last part. And then after that's done, they'll issue you a 10-year green card, and you'll be a regular green card holder. Okay, so now, let's get to the key changes of the program. So these are all things that happened on March 11th, and really, interesting, fascinating things, I think, in the immigration and EB5 world. So the first is that the program was reauthorized until September 30th, 2027. So that's unusual, right? That's a very long authorization. But I think that what happened was that I think the government, I hope that they realized that this lapse was outrageous for a better description, right? It's and people relied on investing in this program, and they were held in limbo for 9 months, right? So I think that they try to address some of those issues so that people would have more confidence in the program if they chose to invest again. So it's approved until 2027, but then also the new legislation, I think this is a great addition, says that if you filed before September 30th, 2026, then they're going to adjudicate your petition. So and this is done so that the same issue that happened this time didn't occur, because you had people that applied either an I-526 pending, or the example that I mentioned where the person had the I-526 approved and was at the consulate just about to get his green card, and the person couldn't do it. So the person is in complete limbo just because the program wasn't reauthorized. And, I think that subtlety is lost on people when they first apply, right? So because, I think that even as immigration attorneys, I'm not sure that we spent that much time warning people about the risk of a program lapsing, because we didn't think it was a real possibility, but, it happened, right? So, so these safeguards have been put in, I think, to give people confidence that that what happened in June of 2021 is not going to happen again. So the big change another big change was that, just in terms of new filings, that if you're filing a new I-526 petition under the regional center program, not the direct investment program, because all of these changes have to do with all of the changes have to do with both programs, but some are only relevant to the regional center program. So the new filings with respect to I-526 petitions, it's 60 days. So, you could spend this time doing due diligence on the regional center and things like that. And usually it takes more than that to put together the source of funds documentation. But I imagine there were some people that were right at the point of ready to file. So maybe they will have to wait a short period of time before they can actually file. So the big change, another big change, is that the investment amount was increased. So we said, during the introduction, that the investment amount was 500,000 and it went up to 800,000. That's the minimum investment amount. And the maximum investment amount was only increased slightly. It was 1 million before, and it just went up to just over $1 million. And what you'll see as well is in the legislation, it's going to stay that way for 5 years, but then after that, it's going to be indexed to inflation. The other big change, or this is a change that happened before, is that because the reason you can invest the lower investment amount is because you are investing in, or you can only, better said, you can only invest the lower investment amount if you are investing in what's called a targeted employment area, a TEA. And if you're not investing in a targeted employment area, then you have to invest the higher amount. So in the past, of course, that was double, right? 500,000 and $1 million. Now it's 800,000 and $1 million and 50, right? So it's not, it's $250,000 more, but it's, $250,000 still a lot of money, but it's not quite as much as it was before. But so what targeted employment area is defined as an area that has an unemployment rate of 1.5 times the national average or over, right? So, or a rural area. So that's defined by the state or the county. Now, what was happening before under the old rules, like for example, we just had a direct EB5 investment approved, and the applicant's office was in Soho, Manhattan, right? One of the richest areas of New York. And she still invested 500,000. Now, under the old rules, you were able to link census tracts together. So we were able to link her census tracts right up through Bronx and Washington Heights and other areas that had higher unemployment, and come up with an unemployment rate that was higher than 1.5 times the national average. So she qualified, and the USCIS agreed. They approved her petition. So now, though, USCIS felt that that was being abused, right? Even in Manhattan, one of the richest areas, Hudson Yards, that's an EB5 project, right? That qualified for the same reasons that I just described. So the USCIS felt that was being abused. So they wanted to kind of take that back and say that the US government is the only group now that's going to be able to determine what designate something as a TEA. So it is going to be harder to meet the TEA requirements. The other kind of thing that the government did under the legislation is that they set aside 32% of the visas for specific EB5 projects, and they're listed here. So that's going to be something that becomes important in terms of timing, or if they're running out of visas. because there are only 10,000 of these allocated each year. So sometimes they don't get used, but something to consider. So, and some other changes, there were some people who like, we had a few applicants that rushed to to file before the June 30th deadline because they were worried that the program wouldn't get extended, and it was still $500,000, and they met the deadline, so they submitted. But we were concerned, well, what will happen if those, let's say they increase the investment amount to 800,000 or another number, what will happen to those applications? But the government has confirmed that they will adjudicate those applications using the lower investment amount of 500,000. And then this is, arguably one of the most significant in terms of having the practical impact on people that are applying under this category, is that, before, when you filed an I-526 petition, you could not file an I-485 concurrently, and you had to wait for the I-526 to be approved. And the I-526 was taking 3 years sometimes to be approved. So, but now if you're in the United States, you can file an I-485 petition concurrently. And what that means is at that time, you can apply for work authorization, you can apply for travel authorization. And these are pretty objective visas, right? Like, they're if you invest 800,000 and you create the jobs, they're pretty objective in that sense. And, most regional centers, reputable regional centers rather, do well in terms of there are lots of people who get the green cards and get their money back and things like that. So this is a really significant change, because it allows people to, someone could enter on a B visa, then enter, let's say, for tourism, and then they hear about the program while they're here, and then they decide to apply for an EB5, and then right when they apply for the EB5, they actually can apply for the I-485, and it gives them the ability and right to stay in the country until that I-485, that could be. And when you apply for the I-485, you're going to apply for work authorization and travel authorization. So it's really a significant change, I think, and a good one, especially given the long waits. The other change is source of funds. It's extended to administrative fees. So, we mentioned with regional centers that those could be extensive. Before, you only had to provide source of funds information related to at that point, the $500,000 that you invested. But now they actually want source of funds information for any fees, so administrative fees, filing fees, and the filing fees are significant as well, and legal fees as well. So if the whole thing cost you $900,000 with the fees and the legal, et cetera, you actually have to provide source of funds documentation for $900,000 rather than $800,000. They clarified that loans and gifts, there was a lot of talk with respect to loans and gifts. If they didn't come from the immediate family members, that they would not be accepted and things like that, but they clarified that that the rules are pretty similar. And then the other kind of big change is that they implemented some items in the program which allow good faith investors to get the green card if the regional center terminates or problems like that. So I think that was a big problem with this program, and maybe they didn't go as far as they maybe could have, but someone could apply for an EB5, invest all this money, and then the regional center could be subject to fraud or something like that, and no fault of the investor at all, but the investor is out of luck, right? So it's but some of those changes will provide some protection. So other considerations for EB5, if you're doing in particular direct investment, you can't just take money and put it in a bank account. You actually do have to have committed contracts for sale. That's definitely something that you want to be able to show to the government that the money actually is at risk. We talked about loans and gifts. The money can come from friends, relatives. The loan, if you do get a loan from a bank, it can be unsecured. If you get it from a friend or relative, it can be unsecured. However, you do have to then prove, same thing with gifts, where that person who gave you the gift or the loan got the money from. So it's the same source of fund analysis that you would have to do if the money was coming from you. We talked already about the considerations if you're purchasing a business, and we talked as well about how much you have to own. For EB5, it can be a very small amount. You can't have guarantees when you're going to a regional center. You can't say to them, well, I want to guarantee that I'm going to get 5% return each year. That's not possible. And then we talked about moving from E2 to EB5, and and really, I think with that, we want to impart the idea that there is a webinar that goes over this in a fair amount of detail. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll turn to an example just to kind of illustrate some of the points that that we're talking about. And I see now that this example is referring to the 500,000. So for the purposes of this example, we'll just assume that the EB5 investment amount is 500,000. This is an example that really goes through the direct investment EB5. So someone who wants to start their own business and is investing. So Helen has obtained, she's here on an E2, and in 2015, she purchased a business, right? So she purchased a business for $300,000, and the business had 5 full-time employees. And when she purchased the business, she paid legal fees of $40,000, right? So she maybe paid business E2, so that would never be an E2 fee, business lawyers, and it was transaction, etc. So then in 2019, so 4 years later, she took another $200,000, and that was a gift someone gave her that was from inheritance or something like that. And then she deposited that money into the bank account, right? So by the time, now by 2019, right when she deposited the money, the company had 10 full-time employees. So she hired 5 more, right? And at the end of 2019, she paid herself a bonus of $100,000 after the company made $1 million, right? So, and again, keep in mind that the number we're talking about, assume that the total investment that's required is $500,000. So on January 1st, 2020, she applied for an EB5 green card. So the example is still fine because she applied for it on January 1st and she was able to, and showing that the total amount she invested is 1.5. So she's saying that she invested 300,000 plus she invested 200,000 plus she invested another $1 million from the retained earnings of the company over the last 5 years. And she included information saying she's already created the 10 full-time jobs, right? And she, has a plan to hire a few more people, but it's not sure she's going to do it. So let's just talk about some of the issues with this case, right? So the first issue is that if you're doing EB5, the money that she spent, the 300,000 for purchasing the business, doesn't count, right? So that doesn't unfortunately count because the purchasing of the business is the money went to the seller, it didn't go into the business, so that would be considered zero for the purpose of investment. The business still can be an investment vehicle, but that 300,000 wouldn't be counted. She would be able to include the 40,000 in legal fees, I think, but I think the more important point here with the legal fees is that she does have to provide source of funds information for that. In the past, she didn't have to, but now if she was submitting an application, she would have to provide source of funds information for the $40,000 as well. So at the end of 2019, she took another $200,000 from, and so here's where source of funds can get really complicated because you got a gift. The petitions take years to be adjudicated. So by the time that they adjudicate, the government is probably going to ask to see that whoever gave the gift paid gift taxes in their home country, or if they're in the US, so declared it as a gift. The other thing is the government is not concerned with, difficulty in getting information. So even though the person got the money or property from someone who passed away 15 years ago, you may have to go back multiple years to see and understand where that person got the money from, and they can be really unforgiving with respect to this. But the other thing is that we say that the money was deposited directly into the business bank account. So that's a big no-no for EB5. The money has to go to Helen's personal account first. The government is very particular about this. The person has to have possession and control of the funds. Petitions have been denied for this, like where someone they're going to a regional center, they're getting a gift from their parents. Instead of the parents putting the money into their personal account, the parents just take the money and send it directly to the regional center. Every single regional center in their instructions will say, don't do that, right? Your petition could be denied if you do it. So then the other kind of thing to keep in mind here is that when she invested, the employees that were at the company before, the 5 full-time employees, those don't count as employees towards the 10. The ones that are, that would count would be employees that she hired after she made the investment, right? So the relevant investment here is going to be $200,000. So it looks like none of the employees are going to count, right? Because the employees all were hired before the any investment related to EB5 was ever made, right? For the purposes of EB5 planning. The other kind of thing to keep in mind is that let's say that the 300,000 was invested in the company and then she invested another 200. So let's say she did meet the $500,000 mark. With EB5, you have to be very, very careful when you pay yourself a bonus or take any salary from the company, because the government will argue that instead of investing 500,000, you invested 400,000 because that you paid yourself 100,000. So you have to be very, very careful on these bonus and salary transfers. And then I think that one of the obvious things is the $1 million doesn't count towards any investment, right? So I think that it's a good example to illustrate that lots of different things come up with EB5 petitions, and you really do need. They're probably the most complicated type of investor-based visa. So they really do require a very specific consideration. We look at timing considerations relating to this visa. They take a long time to adjudicate. So we have regularly sue the US government. I think we've probably sued them 5 times this year, saying that you're taking too long, over 2 years, to adjudicate the petition. And normally what they do, instead of fighting the lawsuit, they just adjudicate it, right? But that, it puts the other people at the back of the line, unfortunately. But it can take 3 years. On their own website, it says that it can take up to 4 years to adjudicate the petition. So you do have to kind of think about that. But the other thing to think about is, now that you can file the I-485 at the same time, that gives people, more options. We have clients now that we have to sit down and talk to them and say, what is it we want to do, depending on where they are in the process, and really work with them to do what's best for them. If you're in the US and currently on a visa, you have to kind of consider different travel and visa expiration dates, because you always want to apply for the EB5 when you have lots of time left on your old visa. But that rule now may not be as important because someone, as long as they don't mind staying in the US after they file the I-485 until they get the work authorization and travel authorization, then then I think that that definitely gives them more options. Dual intent considerations, like, when you're on a visa, you just have to look at what type of visa it is. If you're on H-1B or L-1, then kind of going in and out while you have this pending may not be a problem. Parallel green card strategies, we have a lot of this. We have the person I mentioned that had the EB5 direct petition approved. She also had we were doing a national interest waiver petition for her, and she still wants to continue with that because the national interest waiver petition, the national interest waiver petition is one that's not going to have conditions. So that's one that she wants to continue with it. And then planning is key. I think all of this really just comes down to proper planning. Perfect. So questions and answers. So let's go through the questions and answers. We have a couple of them. So one question that someone asked is whether EB5 money has to come from outside of the US. The answer is no. So when we look at EB5 money, it can come from in the US, it can come from friend, relative, it can come from your own earnings in the US. So there's really no requirement that the money comes from outside the US. The only thing to kind of keep in mind is that the government is going to, wherever the money comes from, you're going to have to provide source of funds information that supports exactly where the money came from. Okay, so So the question really has to do with EB5 Direct and whether two people can pool together to, to both get green cards. And absolutely, like you would just take the requirements and multiply them times 2. So if you wanted 2 visas or 3 or 4 or whatever, and you said, okay, well, we're going to start this particular business, then it would be 10 employees per green card that you planned on getting, and then each person would have to invest the $800,000. So that's that's in essence what how that would work. But yeah, but pooling, I think that during this period of time when regional centers were when that program was closed, then people tended to look to these EB5 programs that had pooling of programs, etc. Then and it became much more popular. So another question here is, if the money is coming from sales of a 5-year-old property, do we then need to also provide the money trail to show how that property is purchased? So absolutely, yes, absolutely. So even if you change that example to say if the money came from a property that was purchased 20 years ago, they don't care. The government doesn't care. They will still want you to prove where you got the money to buy. Like, so in fact, we have an example right now where we did a direct investment and we got an RFE, and the person used his home property as collateral for the loan. And it was when you needed to do that, because now you don't have to do it. The loan can be unsecured. And USCIS was asking about the collateral of we did provide some information, but they wanted more information on the collateral, right? So the house, and so now we're including that exact information that you have here, where where it was purchased. How the person got the money to purchase it. And so what we did is we showed how they got the deposit, but then we also provided information, because it's RFE, we don't want to take any chances, also provided the information on how the person was able to pay the mortgage over the years. So provided tax returns for multiple years. How long does it take for the regional center program to get a green card? Okay, so let's do that question first. How long does it take for the regional center program to get a green card? So there is one regional center program that I'm aware of that has some type of expedited processing, where we actually, one of our clients used them once, and they applied and they were approved within 4 months or something. So no 526 process is a 3-year process on average, right? 2 to 3 year process, and only 2 years if you sue the government. So that's 2 to 3 years, and then you need the green card. So like, even though they're allowing you to apply for the I-485, I think they've made it clear that they're not starting to adjudicate it until the I-526 has been approved. So even after your I-526 has been approved, it's probably going to be 1.5 years before you get the green card. After investing into regional program, once the green card comes, when do I get my investment money? It depends on when do I get my investment money back? It depends on the program. So you should read the fine print. That's the investment documents are very detailed. We had one prospective client that called us and asked us to review the documents, because the regional center was refusing to return their money after they got their green card, etc. So they hired us to look through the documents. We looked through the documents, and it was very clear in the documents that the regional center didn't ever have to return their money, right? There can never be provisions that say they have to return your money, but usually there are provisions that have general exit strategy discussions in terms of what they intend to do. But that's why it's always good to select a regional center that is reputable, been around for a long time, that you can go to their website or from external sources and see that they have given many people their money back and things like that. If the money comes from a company owned 100% by the investor with the equity in the amount of the investment, what is the typical source of funds, of documentation? So yeah, it would be information related to the company. So tax returns of the company, bank statements of the company. So you'd almost treat the company as if it was an individual. So if an individual got money through savings, we would show tax returns of the individual over time, and then bank statements showing that they could accumulate the funds over time. How to find any project is genuine and not a scam, any law for capital guarantees. Well, you just have to do due diligence in the projects. And what you can do is you can hire an investment advisor to look at the projects. But again, though, I think that with that, what I encourage people to do is to select regional centers that have been around for a long time, that have statistics and information where multiple people have gotten a green card, multiple people have gotten their money back, like things like that. That's because if you sign up with a regional center that hasn't been around for even 2 years, they're not going to have any track record, right? They may, and those regional centers, some of them, they'll offer you higher returns, right? 4 or 5% returns, but higher returns often means higher risk. So. Will concurrent filing for I-485 be possible for existing old investors' kids in the US on student visas? I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but the concurrent 485 filing is if you have a pending, yeah, I think I understand the question. So, yeah, so if you have, okay, the person clarified. So if you have a pending I-526 petition, my understanding is that everyone who is eligible to file an I-485 that is in the US can file an I-485. So if that would be the primary investor and their children under 21 and the spouse, right? So if that's what the question was, I believe that's what the answer is. Perfect. Okay, let's see. There's a couple more here. What is the processing time for DS-260 when applying for an approval after an I-526? It just depends on the consulate. So when you apply for an I-526, the information, once it's approved, if you're doing consulate processing, the information goes to the National Visa Center, and the National Visa Center will contact the consulate once they've done their review, and then the consulate will schedule an interview. So it's very consulate specific. So I would say that under a year, though, it would be under a year. Is there a source or a website where we can check project history or people? No, there's a website. There is a USCIS website that lists all of the regional centers, but there's, there may be someone who's done some independent person who has, kind of pulled together information on a bunch of regional centers, but I'm not aware of it. Perfect. Okay, great. Well, that sounds great. Thank you everyone for attending. I think we've gotten through all of the questions, and as I said, like a lot of exciting things going on in the EB5 world. As I said, after the presentation, you'll get a copy of the presentation. You'll get a link to the actual webinar to see the video recording. You'll get an EB5 guide, and when you do click back to the link to the YouTube recording, our YouTube channel, we regularly post that site, so you can hit the notification bell so that you're made aware that are put up there in the future. Thank you very much again, and we look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye.